It ought to be clear by now that Judea didn't have any rules concerning royal succession. It should have. Herod's death in 4 BCE drove the royal family into chaos, as almost all of his children started jockeying for the position of heir presumptive. The trouble began a few years earlier, when Herod had his chosen successors, Alexander and Aristobulus, executed for being more popular than him. Next in line was his son Herod Bethus, who is married to Aristobulus' daughter Herodias. We're going full Habsburg now. As Herodias was the most legitimate claimant by direct descent, Herod Bethus was generally understood to be his father's first pick. But in the final months of Herod's life, Bethus had conspired with his older brother Antipater to assassinate the king. When this was discovered, Antipater was executed, Herod Bethus was exiled to Rome, and Herod rewrote his entire will so that Judea would be partitioned between his next 3 sons and his sister Salome in such a convoluted fashion as to keep any of his heirs from becoming too powerful. This plan was entirely contradictory to Herod's original mission to make Judea into a great Mediterranean power. So Bethus immediately petitioned Emperor Augustus to invalidate the will and confirm him as king of Judea. The emperor gave Bethus a flat no. Judea would be partitioned in accordance with Herod's final will. Augustus made clear, however, that these domains would not be ruled by kings. All of Herod's chosen successors would be tetrarchs, national figureheads in their own right, but nevertheless all subject to the laws and judicial rulings of the Great Sanhedrin. Neither would these domains be hereditary. When a tetrarch died or abdicated their throne, the territory they had ruled would be automatically annexed by Rome. The days of Jewish independence were numbered. Ironically, the first kingdom to lapse would be Judea itself. Archelaus may have been the worst possible candidate to rule over the historic Jewish heartland. His mother, Malthaki, was Samaritan, not Jewish, and thus his legitimacy was contested by the Great Sanhedrin. Archelaus had also been responsible for carrying out many of his father's atrocities, most notably the Purge of the Hasmoneans, and upon taking the throne, had 3,000 protesters executed in the temple during Passover. But the final blow to Archelaus' reign came in 6 CE, when he announced his intention to marry Glaphyra, the widow of his late brother Prince Alexander. Archelaus assumed that doing right by his brother in what he thought was accordance with Jewish law would endear him to the Sanhedrin, but it actually made for a perfect excuse to get rid of him. For one, Glaphyra wasn't Jewish. For 2, she was already remarried to King Juba of Mauritania. She divorced Juba in order to marry Archelaus, but Jewish law prohibited divorcees from remarrying while their exes were still alive. Nevertheless, the two apparently had genuine feelings for each other because Archelaus willingly accepted the Sanhedrin's order to abdicate the throne and spend the rest of his life in exile in Gaul. So let's take a step back and look where we are at this point. There were 3 separate Jewish kingdoms, all of whom were undeniably independent, yet all of them answered to a single central legislature in the capital of the ancestral Jewish homeland, which was now a Roman province. I can't blame the Sanhedrin for getting rid of Archelaus, but by doing so, they wiped their own country off the map, and effectively became a tool by which Rome exercised its influence over the remaining tetrarchies. When Judea became a Roman province, it received a Roman governor, Quirinius, who immediately began a census of the new territory. Whereas the Jews had collected taxes based on income, the Romans collected taxes based on the value of the land one owned, which required a census to assess. This was much more difficult to do than a simple income tax, but the Romans believed it would encourage their subjects to use their land as productively as possible. But as you may recall from an earlier episode, the Jews didn't believe in private property. By having their land assessed, individual Judeans would be implicitly claiming ownership of it, so participating in this census would be a form of blasphemy. This caused a schism among the ruling Pharisees, and one Pharisee dissenter, Judas of Gamala, invoked his status as a direct male descendant of King David to proclaim himself a Messiah. The concept of a Messiah originates with Isaiah's prophecies about the reign of King Hezekiah, which would make him a Messiah. Judaism also regards the notably not Jewish Cyrus the Great as a Messiah for enabling the Jewish leadership to return from exile in Babylon. Basically, a Messiah originally meant anyone who brought about Jewish independence of liberty, but by the 1st century CE, that had changed. After the failure of the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, a certain revisionism began to take hold among the Pharisees, which viewed the descendants of King David as the only true heirs to the Jewish throne, and believed that the Jewish nation could never be truly perfected until the Davidic line was restored. Now, let's be clear. The Davidic dynasty had been out of power for almost 600 years by this point, and claimants to the Davidic line already existed. Remember the Exilarchs? But they were in Babylon, which was then part of the Parthian Empire, and had no interest in returning to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, with so much time having passed since the Davidic era, many Jews who could claim direct male descent from the Davidic kings also lived in Judea, and Judas of Gamala was one of them. Judas and several followers resigned from the Sanhedrin and went into the countryside, urging Jews not to register for the census and burning the farms of those who did. Quirinius quickly crushed this rebellion, but Judas survived, and despite being few in number, his followers, thereafter known as the Zealots, would become one of the driving forces in Jewish politics for the next century. So too would the phenomenon of messianic claimants. Salome's realm consisted of Philistia and Alexandrium. Its capital was at Yamnia, from which it gets its name. Salome's reign was uneventful, and the territory became part of Roman Judea upon her death in 10 CE. That same year in Jerusalem, Hillel the Elder also died. He was replaced as Nasi by his son Simon, who struggled to maintain the stability of the Great Sanhedrin. In 15, Judea got a new prefect, Valerius Gratus, who forced the Sanhedrin to appoint a new high priest every year until they found one he liked. Having accomplished this task, Gratus retired from his post, but he had set a precedent. The high priest served at the pleasure of Rome, and could be removed at any time. In fact, more men would serve as high priest in 60 years of Roman occupation than during the entire First Temple period. Gratus's replacement was Pontius Pilate. Antipas and Philip were the youngest of Herod's heirs, and thus held on to their respective realms for decades longer than the other tetrarchs. They were also in a really good position, as the Galilee had been both the breadbasket of Judea and the ancestral home for many of the kingdom's professional soldiers. The two brothers effectively ran their domains as a single kingdom to their mutual benefit. Ironically, it was this mutual cooperation between brothers that would prove the greatest danger to the region. While visiting Herod Bethus in Rome, Antipas fell for Herodias, and the two basically arranged a wife swap. This, as you may recall, is exactly what had gotten Archelaus in trouble. But Antipas had an exceptionally good relationship with the new Emperor Tiberius. He'd even built a new capital city in his honor. Because of this, the Sanhedrin was pressured into letting the issue slide. However, the same could not be said for the king of Nabatea, the father of Antipas's previous wife, who swiftly declared war on the Galilee. At the same time, the divorce provoked an outcry among the citizenry. The Galilee had long been Judea's most religiously devout province, and the political center of both the Pharisees and the Zealots. In the wake of Antipas's new marriage, a new player emerged, John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived in the Galilean enclave of Perea, and believed the royal marriage to be an act of wickedness that would presage the coming of the Messiah, because Herodias was not only a divorcee, but also the tetrarch's half-niece. To that end, John began inviting Jews to be ritually purified by immersing them in the Jordan River. Coincidentally, Perea was also the part of the Galilean kingdom that bordered Nabatea, and as John gained followers, Antipas began to worry that Perea would simply defect to the invading Arabs out of protest. Herodias' adult daughter Salome blamed John the Baptist himself for starting the war, and famously had his head sent to her on a silver platter. Naturally, this accomplished nothing. Nabatea easily occupied Perea, and the Galilo-Nabatean War continued for several more years. For decades, Antipas and Philip's only challenge had been to keep the Zealots from expanding their influence into Roman Judea. The war made that impossible, and it got worse. By the year 33, Galilee had produced a second messianic claimant, and he was heading to Jerusalem. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gownite level patron Vicky Nelson. If you like this video, you can also donate via Patreon link below. You can also check out my book, An armada of cats travels in Israel, along with links to my sources for this video. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.